Hi everyone. So this is part 2 of my ongoing series with my friend Joseph Pickens, and this conversation was much more of a sort of journal expressing where both of us find ourselves at this moment, sort of inquiring into the surreal and deeply concerning state of lockdowns across the world, and some of the fears that I expressed in relationship to people really accepting the status quo and sort of letting go of any meaningful sense of what's important to them in life. And me and Joseph explored some of the sort of ethical questions around life and quality of life and how that interacts with COVID. We also talked about sort of threading the needle of finding meaningful work, of, playing game B in the game A world and the challenges around that. And finally, a little bit of housekeeping. I have just published an article on Substack. It is the first piece that I've written in about 18 months. It's a new blog under my alias Culture Pilgrim, and the piece is called On Becoming the Artist, and it's got audio accompaniment, and I'll be publishing further writings and notes with audio accompaniment on that Substack, and that'll be linked below. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy this conversation with Joseph. So, bing, 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 red light on. Has the field changed? Hopefully not too much. I'm distilling something, building on what we were just talking about. And it feels kind of like the image of like a system, like an energetic system with a lot of pressure is built up inside of it. And when you were saying like, I don't know like which way to move or like where it's going to go, and I kind of resonate with that sense of like a lot of energy is being built, but no outlet, no channels are appearing yet in the landscape or the field or whatever. Or like a basin or a dam, like filling up with too much water. Like there's a lot of watery, high pressure water energy in the culture, and like people locked up in their fucking apartments for like 6 months, 8 months, 9 months, God knows how long. And it's like we're all tunneling in to our own reality tunnels in different ways to cope with this. And many people seem to have forgotten that there is anything strange going on at all, which is also deeply concerning because there's a certain acceptance of things as they are. So a lot of people are just working their regular jobs, so that's got to be keeping them busy. But I see that as a coping mechanism on some level, a response to how to live under these conditions, to just keep grinding. But creatively, I feel it's the winter. It's like a dark winter, and there's a lot of incubation going on. And I'm seeing other people who are grinding super hard. And as I was saying before, initially feeling like sort of envious or like well, I'm doing a similar kind of thing to these guys and they're doing a lot right now, and so I should be doing a lot. But that's like just not what I'm meant to be doing. And what I'm meant to be doing leads me. And I feel like you at this current moment as well, perhaps, dwelling in this space of like a lot of potential right on the edge, but no like branching thing has broken very clearly yet. And maybe that maps up fractally to like the whole cultural situation. I've had some people speaking in ways that are kind of analogical to this, that there's no pressure outlets, except for like extreme mob action filtered through the like neurosphere into like lots of fear and anxiety, and that's no good.
Yeah, every time I think about like the everything that has occurred due to the pandemic, and realizing just sort of what has changed about the world around me, I suddenly realize like, oh no wonder there's sort of this, what you mentioned and what we've both mentioned, this sense of a dark winter within me. It feels like, I walk downtown here in Santa Cruz and the streets are just dead and all the businesses are closed, and it's just like, I'm like, what's wrong? Why do I feel so, sort of just dead inside? It's like, oh well, probably because the spaces I'm living in, the world around me is that's the spirit of the times. um and we keep waiting for this spring, and I think we're starting to anticipate that spring and what's going to emerge out of that. And people are talking about like the roaring 20s, or another renaissance. I don't really know what to expect. But like I was talking about before we pressed record, like the solution that comes up for me, or sort of the path forward, when I'm thinking about, okay, where is my path going to take me? I'm about to finish this degree I'm doing in a few months, and where's that going to leave me? Do I want to pursue financial security along one path, or what's meaningful along another path, or how did I get those two to work sort of harmoniously together? Because those don't seem to be well aligned. There's a sense of like, okay, well, the answer is to become hypersensitive to what opportunities are in front of me as I'm moving along, and to not be too quick to dismiss things or overlook things, but really feel into particularly the connections I have socially and what opportunities might be there. I mean, all of this feels very speculative, but like that's what I've got in regards to what might come out of this winter that it feels like we're in. It feels like I'm in, at least.
Yeah, it's like we're all sort of, you were sort of speaking earlier about the optimism of the sort of the light of optimism that's available in your present new situation of moving out into your own place. And there was a conversation I had recently. I was talking about the weird circumstance of meeting my girlfriend during this past year and like coming here on a one-way ticket to Berlin, and then just having this like sort of divine, the ordinated learning, loving journey thing. That my friend who I was talking to described that as like a candle in the winter.
Mm.
And so I like this metaphor. He was talking about sort of Christmas, Christmas time, and like the light from the insides of the houses sort of shining outside, and people sort of making more of an effort with that. And in a way, I feel that's what we are doing or called to be doing, is incubating our own version of what that candle in the winter is. And if that thing like isn't giving life to you, if it's reducing the lifeness in your body, then it's not going to be that candle in the winter.
Mm.
And God, like looking through job searches, which I've unfortunately done 2 or 3 times in the last few months, it's just, what kind of world are we living in? When I see the jobs that are available, it's so many people are hiring for a social media manager or a social media promoter. And it's just like, oh, it's like we've made this horrible market controlled virtual hellscape. And now all of our economy is like bending around this thing to feed it. And that's actually people being bent around and contorted into machines. I mean, I'm not like a Luddite. Maybe I am a Luddite of this era, but the Luddites were people in the 1600s or 1700s, for people who don't know, who like smashed up industrial machinery because they thought it was evil and like destroying the local grandma's yarn thing. And so there's something about people sort of giving up, or I guess nobody's vocally giving up, but there's something about the coping of getting along with things as usual that is somehow really, really fucking frightening to my girlfriend. And since we talked about it, to me as well, like the feeling of how many people would be willing to accept this status quo semi-permanently if it was imposed by the state. Like we're already seeing people say, oh no, it's just till Christmas. It's just 6 months. It's just 12 months. It's just going to be the next 2 years. It's going to be 3 years. And the question of quality of life or the meaning of life or the value of life is being completely eviscerated from the arrangement. And this says something very, very dire about our present circumstance. And I'm hearing so many stories about how this trade-off is playing out for families where like somebody who's in their 80s is hospitalized and cut off from a bunch of like all of their family and even the hospital stuff in order to protect them from COVID. And then they die of COVID or something like that. Like that story really sort of felt weighty. And I think there's probably a whole vast universe of suffering and the suppressance of our very life force going on some like deep level throughout the entire collective field and culture. It's quite surreal at times. Like we had a few days a week ago where like Hannah just started feeling really strange about it. And then I was feeling strange about it too. And we were like really recognizing like where we are and sort of breaking out of the normalcy and being like, what is going on? And I'm starting to think in my head, like in the scenario where the government says, stay isolated for another year, stay isolated for another 2 years. Am I going to be the kind of person that would go out on the street if that felt like the ethically right thing to do? Right now, there seems to be a lot of ethical confusion. And there's a sense that we're protecting people. And there's probably a lot of truth to that as well. I don't really know what the answer is, but we seem to be only getting one side of it. And it's very scary, the possibility spaces and tunnels that are being opened for us and that we're just sort of sleepwalking into.
Yeah, that hit me hard, what you said about, the elderly person dying alone in a hospital, like their family not even permitted to be there. It's like that. It really says something about our values, and it's not even a question of like, okay, what do we? It's like it's treated as self-evident, as if sort of, I don't know, the word safety. It's like it's this sort of physical safety. It's all about safety. Every single business you go to, it's like, we're doing everything we can to keep you safe. And it's like, good. That's good. We want to be safe, but it's treated as self-evident that that's sort of this overarching value that we're sort of sacrificing our livelihoods and our 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 relationships too. It's all in the name of safety. And my aunt was hospitalized not because of COVID, but because of other health issues. And even then, like her husband, my uncle, wasn't allowed to see her, and she was very seriously ill. And it's just like, it's madness.
It's fucked up.
Yeah. But there's yeah, and it's I don't know, there's a part of me that thinks the fear of COVID is going to kill us before COVID does. Because it really does do something to us. We're increasingly fragmenting ourselves voluntarily in the name of safety. And the information that's out there, I find it so difficult to trust the information, because of all of the politics involved. It's like, regardless of who it is that's talking, there's some sort of political motivation involved. And I find I'm increasingly cynical of anything that I'm hearing. It's like, I don't know who to trust or how to trust the information we're getting from our institutions. And I found what I've had to fall back on in general when it comes to sense making is who are the people that seem to have their shit together in terms of like who are the individuals that are living wisely and are have a high degree of integrity when it comes to their values. And those people don't sacrifice everything for in the name of safety or some other thing. It's like there's integrity is this sort of whole, it's the whole system in this ongoing, negotiate this dialectic between all the various values. And that's completely missing from the conversation. It's just assumed that there's some highest value, which is our physical safety.
Yeah, this has never happened before. This way of responding has never happened before. Obviously, our circumstances are unique. We're probably more closely concentrated than ever before in history, perhaps. But things have gotten safer and safer and safer, and risk has become more and more and more untenable. Even talking to my grandfather, introducing my girlfriend to my grandfather a little while back, he was telling us all of these anecdotes about how things were when he was working, and just like a lot of men climbing up ladders onto telephone poles and roofs, and sense that risk was expected. But then equally, this other guy who's about my grandfather's age in my men's group was saying like men were expendable at that time too. Like that was also the spirit, expendability of men in war. I don't know if we feel that way culturally now. Like, I'm not sure that there would be the momentum of expendability of men to ever create the conditions of that kind of warfare on a global scale again. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's very deep coded, but at least in the West, we seem very averse to this risk. And I think that might be somehow related to the lack of private conversation about topics of existential concern, such as death, or such as the consideration of what would be a life path that you would be willing to tread in full expectation of the possibility that it could lead to your death in some unknown in the future. Like, what does that look like? These kinds of conversations. And when we say, X or Y is not showing up in the conversation, I almost want to say, like, what conversation? What fucking conversation are you referring to? Because I don't think the broadcast media conversation is a conversation. I think it's a shitstorm of mimetically contorted information being fired at people into different camps. Okay, so that's TV gone. What about online? Well, the entire online public forum is captured, market captured, and also politically captured, because the market force dominators all have certain political orientations. I think it might actually be a trap to think that they're all just progressive. I think they're also concerned with their own power and are naturally going to work with the state and support the state in preserving that. So I'm feeling the nefariousness of that a lot more, and we should be feeling it a lot more, because as Hannah keeps telling me, the social media companies and Amazon, Google, Facebook, and Twitter are making enormous amounts of money in this period, enormous amounts. It's incredibly profitable for them, for us to all be indoors and in a state of fear that makes us more prone to addiction. I'm throwing out a lot of stuff right now, but
It's good stuff.
and Amazon's doing really well too.
Yeah.
Like just for a sense of scale, like I think it was tens of billions of dollars of value were created for Bezos of Amazon and Zuckerberg of Facebook upon Biden's election, on the basis of optimism. It's like, oh, things are good now. Billions of why is this energetic potential all flowing into the hands of these people when they're not really innovating in our interests?
There was something, well, you brought up death. And I thought that stood out to me as being important. Like, our relationship to death is super screwed up. And that's sort of at the heart of this, the way we're responding to a global pandemic that's arguably not that deadly. It says a lot about our relationship to death. I think this emphasis on safety at all costs. It's like we don't know how to reconcile death. Like, we don't know how to deal with death. I mean, you look at what we do in the healthcare industry. It's like we will keep someone alive when it's like, for years and years, when we're basically, if we were to just pull the plug, they'd be dead. And it's like, and it's like a harsh reality to recognize that, for some people, it's like death is the next, like that's where they're going. It's like their life has come to an end, and that's a harsh reality to come to terms with. But it's like we at the expense of all quality of life, we'll put off death as long as possible, because we just don't know how to deal with it. And so maybe there's something important in there about coming to terms with death and making peace with the fact that everything dies and that we're all going to die. Like, there's yeah, and I'm noticing I'm bringing into this conversation, I think, a lot of pent up cynicism and frustration. I'm noticing that it's coming out in the way I'm expressing myself. But I think that in and of itself is telling of it. This is something that's been hard for me to talk about because it's so politically and culturally captured that to speak of it, you know, to speak to the world on this issue is to sort of invite a whole bunch of opinions from the world about, sort of assumptions about who I am and where I stand that are inevitably going to be horribly inaccurate. But then I start falling into that sort of the narrative that the world is weaving for me and my life when I go to express myself. It's the same thing I feel when any sort of when I enter into any sort of a political discussion, with my family, for example. I don't even know where to begin because it's like there's all these layers in how I view things. But if I enter through one, one way of entering the conversation, then because I'm entering there, that suddenly leads the people I'm talking to believe that I'm of a certain political opinion. And, there's all of these loaded assumptions because we think of, there's just like sort of two ways to be when it comes to politics. And thus, because this whole COVID thing is so politically wound up, there's only two real opinions to have about this virus. And it just makes it impossible to enter any sort of conversation. And so I'm feeling that frustration of I don't know how to express myself, taking into account all of the complexity and nuance of how I feel about all of this. And I'm feeling that pent up frustration, and sort of my response to that frustration is just to sort of disengage. And trying to re-engage now, it's like there's a lot of, I'm just very cynical about the whole thing. So that's something that's present for me right here.
I'm very interested in that frustration. I think a lot of good music comes out of frustrated energy somehow. And yeah, I've noticed a similar experience where I'm sort of in the position you describe. I was telling you about in the men's group. I think this dropping into the energy in the body, and then like somebody sort of naming like aggression or intensity or something, and just like sort of permitting it to come into the space. And then suddenly like you get these guys who like kind of being quite shy and stuff, like suddenly like like there's all this like fire that's not being allowed to burn as it properly should, perhaps to the detriment of everyone. And of course, with masculine fire, we have our own major cultural issues and like disbalances and fears and dogmas. So there's that sort of playing into it. But really, I think the broader fire that we're talking about is not confined to men or women. It's really anybody who's really taken that bold move of feeling feeling things like it matters, feeling things in a way that you feel willing to take risks. And yet there's sort of, for a lot of people, I think there's not knowing where to channel that. Like even were we to drop into it, we find that there is an insufficient number of creative channels. And you want creative channels when you're frustrated, because otherwise it's going to be destructive channels, or disassociative channels, or addictive channels. Which I'm sure there's so much shit going on that if we had the right intuition for what the appropriate metric would be, we would really get a completely different grasp on the psycho-embodied situation of the populace. I'm sure there's a lot of ice cream and beer being drunk, which sometimes is necessary and good to treat yourself. But like if you slip off that horse and you're in an improperly balanced pairing with your partner or you're on your own, like who's going to hold you accountable? You know, maybe even if you have a job. So I'm sure there's a lot of psychic pain and imbalance going on in the collective field that's not being accounted for by any of the instruments of information or like reflection of the state of things. And so what might those appropriate instruments be? I think we're kind of in the project of realizing that it's people like us who actually have the conversation that we want and need to have at whatever risk. And there is risk because whilst it feels like my channel is just starting to be born, like what are those creative forms that are mine to flow into? Who am I to become? But in the nasty blue light surveillance state, corporate controlled information field, those channels are becoming more and more precarious. And we're seeing a very curious phenomenon in which the most free thinking individual, well-balanced people that we know and others are being caught up in dragnets, which are completely cutting them off from the information field. Speaking about Brett Weinstein and Jordan Hall, and I guess Jim Rat too, of Game and the other Game B admins. I don't know who they are, but they were all swept up in it. So it's showing up in our field, and we are perhaps sensitized enough to pick up on it. But I don't know that, well, you know, it's hitting the far left and the far right too, right? Antifa accounts are getting blocked and some right-wing things are being blocked as well. But the real sense that you, not somebody else, you are the one who will ultimately be losing your freedom if you're not vigilant. That's again been forgotten. It's been forgotten And we've learned it so many times collectively in the last few hundred years, I guess. Maybe all the way back to like Christian martyrs being burned at stake or something. But I hope you feel from what I'm saying so far that I feel like I'm in a different field of perception to the information field that's out there in the public domain. My sensory landscape and my salience landscape has become very unique and individuated to me and my girlfriend and the life that we lead and the sense-making dialogos art and like high school friends and whatever networks that we're plugged into is constituting our reality tunnel. And well, it's not a tunnel, it's more like a landscape. But that's interesting. I never picked up on that. Like, I've never thought to break out of that linguistic little container.
Yeah, maybe that's how it should be. In a lot of ways, part of my detachment from, global and national politics is just it's too it's too distant. Like it's out of there's so many things I could fix or change or make better about the immediate world around me, just like my own little studio apartment here, or my relationships with my family and my community and my my local community, the town I live in. It's like there's so much that could be fixed in a bottom-up manner that trying to look for it from the top down, from this behemoth that's increasingly corrupt, feels like it's like, no, I'm we need to be serving what's local to us. And I think it's part of what's I don't know. I've begun to start thinking about the relationship between all of these networks at sort of this hierarchical way in which they're organized, at the level of family and the town, the city, the state, or the province, and the country, and how those layers relate to each other. And at each layer, what is there's a way of abstracting all of this and looking at like how networks relate to each other in all these fractal layers. I think that a good place to look is in biology and ecology. It's like we need our systems to be designed in the same way that an organism is designed. In essence, they're the same thing. It's like it's an adaptive system that's performing all the functions that an adaptive system performs, and it's going through all the the same processes of poiesis that an adaptive system goes through. Anyway, all that is to say, it seems like there's this increasing attractor state that is the local, and this notion of localism. That, you know, if some appliance falls apart in my home, I'm not going to go looking to the federal government to fix that. It's like, I'm going to go to my, you know, local plumber or whatever. And it's like, that's the level which that problem should be solved.
Well, perhaps if you're in the Soviet Union, you have to consult the National Soviet People's Plumbing Association and go through some immense bureaucracy to do that. But fortunately, we don't. I feel there's something about this local, this view of the stack and what it would be to shift that sort of stacking into something more organic and fractal in nature, from something that has the resemblance of the aesthetics of late 20th century corporate buildings.
Yes.
There's a horrible building by Allianz Insurance in Berlin that is just, I fucking hate it. It sits right next to a park and it just sticks up like an ugly. In my opinion, it's no better than like really poorly done graffiti on a sidewalk. But they have money, so it's okay. The thing that came up for me when you were saying that was the body, or like my local of my house, my space. And I'm noticing my tiredness kicking in. So we should wrap the recording in like 10 or 15 minutes or whenever feels good. But like, we are biological. So if we're looking for something to do with the biology to be in right relationship and stacking, it's got to start with our biology. And for me, big parts of that is like my sensitivity to like foods and certain drinks and caffeine and stuff has changed a lot in recent years. So I'm really like fine tuning and like cutting out things that feel like my body is telling me this is bad for you. And I feel like when I lean more into that sensitivity, I'm getting like kind of more things that I'm realizing that I'm doing that are like subtle little addictions or whatever that I need to identify. Recently it was caffeine, which I didn't think that I was addicted to, but I was drinking tea like every day for years and couldn't conceive of not doing that habitually. I think sex and intimacy and everything in that world all those like very deeply embodied layers of relationship, I guess even with like your family, like keeping that like emotional right relationship at the embodied level, and like God, like even with the information field being as fucked as it is, like having something in your immediate field that is really distracting you or like really challenging, or if you had like some passive thing with your partner or something that neither of you could identify for years and years and years, that you've both been avoiding, it's connected to some traumas or something, like that kind of stuff is very present is actually constituting most of your reality now, wherever you are, because that's who you're spending all your time with, is who you're with. And if it's with yourself, it's with yourself as well. But that feels like a pretty important, like it feels like we sort of want to move between those spheres on the stacks at different times. Like at some time, like, oh, there's a fire in the city, like we need to organize at the city level. But right now, the circumstance we're in really calls for some like unique, like, I almost think I feel like it would be of great value for the right people to be really exploring their field, and whatever that means, whether it means like, sex or like music or creativity or deep philosophical inquiry, sensing into your walks really deeply, walking the deep solitude path of life in a sort of beautiful, meaningful way. Doing psychedelics is a very significant one that I don't want to just throw in like I usually do, sort of just like signpost it, like, oh yeah, this is important. Very sort of meaningful and important, and perhaps one of the most important things to talk about in terms of this like totally surreal hellscape reality that we're getting a peek into and that some people are settling into. I think taking something which allows you to break free of the broken patterns and reconstitute your patterns in new ways in your immediate place. It's not like you've got work to go to. It's not like you've got all this. If you don't have kids, you probably don't have loads of other responsibilities. And this is by no means a recommendation. It's really a message to the person who's right to hear it. I think that can be something that will, in the right context, help to catalyze the level of transformation and possibility that's needed. And in terms of quantity, I think that can be very, very little. I think for the right person, one psychedelic experience a year can be more than adequate to catalyze a crazy amount of personal searching and insight, and sort of the difficulty and challenge of recognizing those things that have you out of alignment and getting you back into alignment. And I guess it's important here to see that this, like, whatever I'm saying about psychedelics, I don't want to be interpreted in relationship to like an abstracted meme or icon, or like, what's your idea of psychedelics? What does that word mean to you, based on, whatever really poorly constructed reality tunnel you've got on it. I want it to be understood in relationship to everything else that I'm saying, including the branches of the landscape of trauma and how that relates to spirituality and becoming, love, and in relationship to becoming this new sort of human being that's emerging, this kind of meta practitioner, new renaissance, polymath, thick, polymathic kind of person who's really paying a lot of attention and care to what they're doing and doing a diverse range of things and constantly sort of experimenting within the process of becoming and being. So yeah, I guess I opened the psychedelic can of worms here, but we can ride out those waves for as long as we want to.
You know, what's interesting is I find that there's sort of this space in which this sort of psychedelic branching pattern thing that you're talking about is very present. Like I'm in it and it's flowing, and I'm but it's like there's a domain in which that's present for me, which is very much, it's local, and it's connected with nature, it's connected with the body, it's connected with the relationships I have locally. And then in thinking about moving to I'm thinking about, okay, like what am I doing after graduate school? How am I going to make money? And thinking more and more and sort of like I'm looking outward into the corporate world, like Silicon Valley in particular, and sort of trying to relate to that and come to terms with it and sort of feel it in this way that's sort of hopefully will transcend the current relationship that I have to it, which is very much there's a fear there. There's like this standoffishness of I don't know, that there's certain people, you know, like certain men that embody Silicon Valley. And when I try to relate to those men, it's like there's this total disconnect. And but it seems like I'm coming to this place where it's like, okay, those men, those people, I need to learn how to relate to these people. Like I need to learn I need to learn their language. I need to learn their game, but not be captured by the language and the game somehow. And this is like this threading the needle that we were talking about earlier of like of pursuing what is sort of the creative thread that's wanting to be created through me is sort of how I think about it. Following that and the logos of that, but then also recognizing, okay, I have practical everyday realities, and somehow like I have financial needs, and somehow that has to that problem needs to get solved. Somehow the logos of my creative thread has to somehow afford that in order to afford the some financial means in order to be sustainable. And it's sort of, so I'm that's part of what I've been sort of alluding to in this conversation, or earlier in this conversation, which is that creative thread that's sort of opening up for me. It's like it's opening up to what was previously antagonistic towards. There's still that level of antagonism is like like the essence of Silicon Valley is something that is exploitative of this creative thread that I'm weaving. And so there's a rivalrous relationship between those two. and somehow this threading the needle has to be I don't know what I don't know what it is, but it has to be something that's, I've been watching like Game of Thrones, and I think that's feeding into a lot of my cynicism when it comes to how I'm seeing the power dynamics of our political world, because that's really what Game of Thrones is just that, and just the atrocity that those dynamics are in the political world. And but it's interesting of how like the people who you'll notice the people in that show that you the few people, I'll say the few people in that show that you're like, okay, you have something that's noble or honorable about you, and like, what is it? And part of it is like they're in this situation where they have to play the game. Like you don't get to not play the Game of Thrones, but you somehow you still recognize like, okay, this is ultimately a game that's going to destroy itself. Like it's not the it's not the infinite game. It's not the
nice.
It's not the game I want to be playing, but yet still I have to somehow learn how to play it, even though it's like, I'm this woman, and this guy I'm supposed to marry, his father killed my brother, and yet somehow I just have to like, okay, this is my reality, and I'm gonna not run away from this. I have to learn how to move in this space, even though it's like this just atrocious reality where like the person you're being forced to marry is, murdered your family or something like that. And it's like, obviously our reality isn't quite that horrific, but there's this, it's that same realization for me of like, how do I come into relationship with, in essence, sort of something that's increasingly exploitative of my creativity, in a way that's not going to corrupt me. Like how do I play game A in a way that is practically necessary, but can still allow me to be giving birth to the sort of the beginnings of game B. Like how do I do that? How do I thread that needle? That's the question that's like increasingly present for me, and it's really been drawn out in this conversation.
Likewise, my friend. I feel completely periodically immersed in this question, but my relationship to it is also switching quite palpably in ways that are very disadvantageous and scarce, and ways which are very abundant and life-giving. And so leaning more towards those ones has been the main thing from the research of my life right now. I think there's something about what you just did with Game of Thrones, or like taking like the cultural pornography of television. Game of Thrones really feels right on the edge for me of meaningful storytelling and just addictive garbage. And so much of what I try and like, I just don't fucking watch much TV at all. And when I do watch TV or movies, and having grown up in a household where I watched a ton of movies, very well schooled in action movies and a lot of movies, I just find it's hollowed out garbage. And so if you have the depth of mind or heart to notice this, then all that's available to you is to like, well, what is this? Like you're playing the alternate game in your reinterpreting of the culturally predominant artifact in this different way. And now I want to do that too, by noting that there are a lot of people playing different games within the Game of Thrones as well. There's not just one Game of Thrones, and there's not just one dimension of play. The Red Woman, for example, the people who are playing in magic and mythical realms are playing on a different board to the other people. The White Walkers, which are very similar to zombies, which are also a very prominent theme culturally right now, play a different game to the other people. They're almost not aware that they're playing a game. And there's something interesting too about like the way we tend to like, it's like the rumination of things, of the things that are present but not named, is somehow brought out into the most popular cultural artifacts. If you can notice them, if you can notice the hollowness, then you can really see a different story about where we are. But it is hard to do that, like consider the lilies of the field move of the Sermon on the Mount, and be like, well, birds don't worry about their dinner tomorrow, so neither should I. That's kind of like, I'm sure there aren't many people who are treading it that close, treading it in lockstep with the logos that closely that they're not worried about what they're going to eat the next day. But I think we can probably be, and by necessity are, not playing the totally scarce game either. Like, we're playing in a field of potentiality that's there. And we know it's there because we can feel it. Like, we can feel our own potential. I can feel it when I pick up guitar and I thought I couldn't play any instruments, and now I'm jamming. And now I'm like having these awesome experiences. Just feel like I'm feeling everything more than I was before, for a variety of reasons. But guitar is an instrument that really is affording that for me right now. That's a gain. That is a fucking positive thing. And part of this scarcity is to not be able to see how anything that we do that's not instrumental or techne oriented is of value. And I'm sure that threads in somewhere with the challenge you're facing of talking to people who are not so concerned with the meaning of their individual life, or are sort of unreformed autists. And I think there's an interesting challenge too for, there's probably a disproportionate number of like dispositionally autistic people in the sense-making, culture-changing moment right now. Like, that almost for me is like the archetypal thing of this. Like, obviously I identify with it to some degree, and like Jordan and other people, it's really the like intellectual, complex-minded autist who learned to feel and then like broke into all these new dimensions and is now actualizing something that feels totally like like to have that embodied experience of breaking into a new dimension of expression is where it's at. The question of putting that out into the world and how you do that and all the bullshit that's involved with that, and whether people, whether anybody likes it or not is there and secondary, hopefully. But like, I feel like we're playing the infinite game. I feel like this dialogic, multi-dimensional medium that I've been playing in with SenseSpace since before SenseSpace, really, but sort of in an accelerated and deepening and widening fashion, that game might become the cultural zeitgeist. Dialogos, I was just talking to Hannah about this today. It seems to be becoming the zeitgeist of sense making, or at least it's gone from like this niche corner to like one of the main things that everybody's talking about. And I think more people talking about it will lead to more people. My throat's getting sore. I was recording stuff earlier today. More people are talking about it, and so they're going to be more interested in practicing it. And then there's going to be this whole rapidly declining voice. It's going to be this whole thing of like, if that does catch, and let's suppose that it can, because it is actually the meta psychotech art form that is going to be the thing that allows us to do everything else on some level. When that catches, a lot of people are going to start attaching meanings to it and what it is, and there'll be that threat of market capture as well. And maybe that threat of market capture will be mediated through you and me, since we're pretty close to this thing.
Yeah, at the heart of that is the capacity for listening. And in a dark winter, there's very little to listen to, and so you can sort of lose that capacity to some degree. And I felt that like this literal winter, to a large degree, is this. I don't know. If I think about spring and summer, it's like what that is like this sort of rich, interconnected flourishing of life, and particularly, I'll narrow in on the word interconnected there. It's like there's a lot of connection. And in winter, there's sort of like things go into hibernation. There's this fragmentation that happens, and isolation. And in that state, it's like, why expend effort tuning my ear to be particularly sensitive when there's not a lot happening? And in some sense, this winter is happening on a large scale in modern industrial society as we've fragmented and splintered, and the way of the way in which we communicate has become less and less dialogical and more sort of this asymmetric broadcast from our institutions, that broadcast mode. And so there's less listening. Like, we've forgotten how to listen.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really, I've been thinking about this a lot because I've been, in the midst of it, in the depths of it, this in the last month or more, and watching my own experience and what's happening there, where there's just sort of this, it's like a depression where I'm not motivated to do anything, and I could do things. I could pick up some creative thread, but there's this, it just stops short. It's like, well, but like there's, it's like there's I don't care about committing to one thread, and that commitment that's lacking is a lack of listening, because every every creative act requires listening to what is wanting to be created, and I don't have that capacity when I'm in the midst of winter. I've lost that capacity in some sense. And in order to afford that spring, you have to learn to start listening again and start letting things grow. And in that learning to listen, you learn to commit to cultivating what's trying to grow. Yeah, and dialogos is just that. It's a commitment to cultivating what's trying to grow in the context of a dialogue, which hopefully we're doing here to some degree.
Yeah, this is very well put. Dialogos is the commitment to like paying care and listening for what wants to grow in a dialogue. And that is affording of listening and what wants to grow in the dialogue of your life with yourself, or yourself in relation to life, or however you want to spin it.
Yeah.
Feel a lot of like just hearing you talk about the spring made me feel the spring, like the anticipation of it. And there's also this like, we are being forced to really experience winter in a real way, in a way that we have been detached from. And so in this curious way, and there are a lot of curiosities to this time, one of which is that COVID seems to provide a very unique and precise interruption to the acceleration of our machinery oriented towards the total destruction of all the complexity that we have created. So there's that. But then at the micro level of like winter, like we're really feeling the winter this winter. And I'm really feeling the winter this winter because I'm not in Santa Cruz. In Berlin, it is 0 degrees or 1 degree Celsius most days outside. So it's really takes some work to get yourself outside, and you can get really easily stuck. You can just like not go outside for a day or two. And well, it's never been 2 days, but I can see that temptation is there. And I hope, and in my hoping, speak into possibility and sort of make a tentative contract with my future self that this spring can be a spring into action, and that action involves getting outside and talking to people. Whatever conditions we're afforded by the state. Like when I go outside on the street that I live on, which fortunately has a lot of like restaurants and cafes, so it's fairly it's pretty bustling when it's summertime and not COVID. But when I go out and I see a lot of people on the street, and it's really cold, but there's a lot of people out eating on the street, being together outside, that gives me hope. And it's a very foundational thing that we're being asked now, almost. Like, forget all the complexities of climate change, forget fixing our, upregulating our communication to this new era phase shift. It's just the basic of, is there enough spring in us that this psychic lockdown is ended on some meaningful level this spring, this summer? Because I think if we are kept inside, if we are kept isolated and compartmentalized, and we're willing to accede through that, through the heat of summer, then we are truly fucked on some level. Like, even during, the worst of wartime, people were gathering together. If it's hot, they go outside, they hang out in the parks, And on some level, I also think that the power, just as the winter is really gripping us now, the heat of the summer and the temptation of life is going to be a force that our like techne-autistic information machinery and government is not able to account for. Like, I'm not hearing any talk about it, but I hope and suppose that it will not be possible to maintain the status quo when it starts being sunny and beautiful outside, and surely not for the long roasting summer.
Did you say temptation of life or temptation toward life?
Yes.
Because that stood out to me. It's like there's this in the dark winter that's sort of being foisted upon us. There's like this seductive quality and almost like this. It's hidden. It has to take place in the shadows almost of the being tempted toward life, like real livingness with other people and real sociality. But it's like this, it's going to happen. It's like there's because that's just the life is tempted toward life. Like that's the movement of things. But I just loved that you put it in that way.
It's like the beautiful, this is a neat little thread, because my last sense-based conversation with Andre Pellegrini from the men's Future of Male Specific Trauma group, we were playing with these nature metaphors, and right at the end, we sort of ended energetically, we'd had the spring and summer of the conversation, and then it sort of toned down. And then we ended with this image of a sort of pine covered in heavy snow and a
right.
heavy quiet. And then the image that you're seeding now is when the snow is gone and the first little saplings or whatever start to pop. And it really feels like life is begetting life. Like, one thing grows and then something else grows, and then little small animals and birds and all kinds of things just start coming out of wherever they come from and go. I don't really know, but that's a nice image to, I feel, sort of wrap things up on with regards to the recording. But
I agree.
if there's more, if you want to surmise, I think.
Hmm. I don't know. I think that might be a good place to call it.
Awesome. All right. Well, I enjoyed doing this. I don't know what we're going to do with it,
Likewise.
but this was good. Sweet.